This is Miriam Terlinchamp, Executive Director of Judaism Unbound. A brief note before we begin today's episode. It was recorded a couple of months ago, prior to January 15th ceasefire agreement, and also prior to President Trump's statements on February 4th, articulating a vision for the mass displacement of all Palestinians in Gaza and proposed U.S. takeover of the area. Realities on the ground in Israel-Palestine are ever-changing, and there are new developments on a daily and weekly basis. We believe the contents of this episode are evergreen in many ways, but want listeners to understand that the conversation took place prior to these recent events, which is why they are not mentioned. With that, here's today's episode of Judaism Unbound.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 469, Israel-Palestine Discourse Online. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're continuing our series of episodes exploring Israel-Palestine discourse in North American Jewish life. This is the fourth episode in the series, and we're especially grateful to be hearing from so many of you that you've been finding the series helpful. Please keep your feedback coming. A couple of weeks ago, we talked with Susanna Heschel about one of the places where the discourse has left something to be desired, namely university campuses. And today we're talking about another space that's often not modeling the best ways of talking to one another. That's online space. Our guests today, Mira Sucharov and Joshua Shanes, actually know both spaces very well because they're both professors, and they're also the co-founders of a Facebook group that's emerged as a thoughtful hub for online discourse about Israel-Palestine. The Facebook group, which was founded in 2021, is called Drachim, a new path forward for Israel-Palestine. A brief description of the group from its own Facebook page: Drachim is a group for those committed to Palestine solidarity principles who also feel an emotional connection to Israel, especially through language and culture and related expressions. As they say, many Israeli-connected groups deny Palestinian rights, including refugee return, and many Palestine solidarity groups don't create a nurturing environment for those who care about Israel, especially in the cultural sense. Mira Sucharov and Joshua Shanes will give us a fuller picture of Drachim's founding and its evolution over time in just a few minutes. But as you can hear from even this brief self-description, Drachim aims to create a space that's pretty rare on the internet. Before we hear more, just a bit more introduction of our guests. Mira Sucharov is professor of political science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. She is the author or editor of 5 books, including Borders and Belonging, a memoir, and Social Justice and Israel-Palestine, Foundational and Contemporary Debates. Mira Sucharov has published dozens of articles and book chapters, and her latest article is entitled Dear Omar, Dear Mira, Exploring Zionism Across the Ethnic Divide. Her many op-eds and articles have appeared in the Globe and Mail, Haaretz, The Forward, The Daily Beast, The Toronto Star, The Jerusalem Post, JTA, and Jewish Currents. She's currently working with Omar Dajani on a podcast about Palestinian and Jewish life in Jaffa called The Vacant Lot, as well as a book about equality and attachment in Israel-Palestine. Mira Sucharov serves on the advisory council of New Israel Fund Canada and on the North American Steering Committee of A Land for All, 2 states, 1 homeland. Our second guest, Joshua Shanes, is professor of Jewish Studies and director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. He has published widely on modern Jewish history, religion, politics, and anti-Semitism in both academic and popular outlets. Joshua Shanes' first book, Diaspora Nationalism and Jewish Identity in Habsburg Galicia, appeared in 2012, and he's currently completing a history of Jewish Orthodoxy from its German origins until today for the Key Words in Jewish Studies series at Rutgers University Press. And of course, as we said earlier, our guests are the co-founders of the Facebook group Drachim, a new path forward for Israel-Palestine. So let's learn about what they're doing to make at least one corner of the internet a more constructive place. Mira Sucharov, Joshua Shanes, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
So you started a Facebook group back in 2021 called Drachim, a new path forward for Israel-Palestine. In the description, you talk about its goal as filling a gap. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what that gap was back in 2021 that you saw the need to fill, and if it's changed, how would you talk about it today?
It was back during the much smaller war than the one we have now between Israel and Hamas back in May of 2021. And I was cycling downtown in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, for those who aren't familiar. And there was a parade of Ottawa Jews, a car parade, circling through downtown as I had pulled my bike up to a stoplight. And there were blue and white balloons and honking. And it was a parade, I surmised, in support of Israel. And I just felt so alienated. And I just said to myself, where are my people? And then I thought, well, I could join a group like Jewish Voice for Peace, but I don't quite feel at home there either. And there's one thing lacking within Jewish groups that were and are primarily devoted to Palestine solidarity. And that one thing is a feeling of connection to Israel, a feeling of emotional attachment to the place. So I felt there was a gap. I felt I needed to create a group devoted to Palestine solidarity, devoted to Jews who feel a real emotional connection to Israel. And it's funny because I first was just musing about this on Facebook. I think I came home from my bike ride and I just said, where's the group for me? And people started responding saying, if you create one, I'll join it. And I actually hadn't really intended to create one. And I thought, oh, well, and I guess there's a need. So I reached out to Josh, who I felt was swimming in similar waters to me. I mean, we have different paths and some different interests, but I felt that in this, Josh and I were really aligned. And so we created a group. And right now it exists on Facebook, but it's meant to be an actual real life group.
So it was Mira's idea. We spent quite a lot of time trying to hash out the kind of ground rules of the group, and there were two directions. One was that we wanted a group that would not be like so much of social media with, snark and laughing emojis at people and getting one-ups. And we wanted something that was something of a community. And that was part of our ground rules from the beginning. And we wanted a group that was equally committed to Jewish life and culture and Palestinian life and culture. And actually, early on, we had hoped that it would explore culture a lot more than politics. Because of the way history has gone, that's not the way it worked out. But that was part of our design. And I felt the same as she did. I felt that there was really no place where I belonged. I really couldn't go to JVP or even something like If Not Now. And I have a lot of respect for some of the young people in If Not Now. But that was not going to be for me because they didn't seem to be celebrating both cultures the way I wanted. There was an additional aspect for me that I don't think Mira shares, which is that I've been in the Orthodox world for 30 years. And when you live in the Orthodox world, it's a very right-wing world. But what people don't realize often is as you go to the so-called progressive or left-wing end of the Orthodox world, the open Orthodox world, the YCT world, and things like that.
YCT is Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, a modern Orthodox rabbinical school.
As you go to the so-called progressive or left-wing end of the Orthodox world, the open Orthodox world, the YCT world, and things like that, Zionism not only becomes more right-wing, but becomes more front and center as the core of Judaism. And so that was also very alienating for me. And I really couldn't speak at Shul at all. And so I really wanted the place where I could speak. And I wanted to be at least somewhat private. No private group on Facebook is truly private, as I tell my children, and I'm sure Mira tells hers, the internet is forever. And even if you think it's private, it may not be. But there's a certain level of privacy to a private group that I think we've managed to achieve. And we've been able to have these conversations that really do celebrate equality and celebrate both cultures in a way that is hard to find, because typically, and this has become obviously much worse in the last year and a bit, spaces are very tribalist and they're very focused on one tribe or another. And so what I really wanted and what Mira wanted and what I think most of the people in our group want is some place that can have a space for all human lives and both cultures in Israel-Palestine. And I have to say, the first couple years, it was a nice place. It was not nearly as active as it became. It was a place that we could go, but it was not a place I went every day. It was not a place that had posts every day. It was a lot quieter than it became after October 7th.
The fact that numbers have more than doubled since October 7th and more than doubled almost in the immediate aftermath of October 7th suggested to me that there are people in our community clamoring for a different path. when I give talks and people ask me, where do you turn for hope? It's Drachim. I wanted to add one more thing. In order to join Drachim, one must not only agree to the ground rules of the type of communication we want to instill, but they have to agree to 7 principles. In that way, it is meant to be a bit of an actual organization. So when we say that we have 1,100 members, there are many members who we turn away, who don't get around to agreeing to the principles, who maybe are ambivalent about the principles. So it is a group to signal a belief in not only the furthering and the nurturing of Israeli, Jewish, and Hebrew and Palestinian Arabic language culture, but that believes in the right of return for Palestinian refugees. And this is something that makes us quite different from nearly every other Jewish group that also feels a connection to Israel. We also say that we're agnostic about whether it should be 2 states, 1 state, or a confederal approach. But what we do say is that we shouldn't cling to the 2-state solution as the only solution, because that solution, given the pace and intensity of settlement building in the West Bank, to call for a conventional 2-state solution as the only solution is, in effect, something that forces Palestinians to wait endlessly for their freedom. So that's another principle among the 7 principles.
We have a variety of opinions within a band in the group, which is healthy. We turn people away if they can't subscribe to the 7 principles, but we do have a variety of opinions. And someone came to me once and said, I'm okay with the right of return for Palestinian refugees, but I want Israel to make a deal with the Palestinians and trade it for a 2-state solution. And I said that was fine as long as you acknowledge the basic right of return. What one cannot say is, I want there to be 2 states someday, but that 2 states will happen someday in the far future when Jews feel safe giving up hegemony. The call for equality has to be immediate, and it has to be full equality, which is to say the idea that someday there'll be 2 states, but the Palestinian state won't be an actual state because Israel is going to retain all security power over their airspace and water. That would not be within the bounds of the group. If you think of somebody like Michal Manikin, right, who's clearly would be I think is a member of the group and would be within the bounds of the group, he believes that 2 states is the way to go and is calling for the immediate removal of all Jews from the West Bank to create 2 states, and 2 genuine states where the Palestinians would have full sovereignty in their state. That would be within the bounds of the group. Many others say that's impossible. We should just accept that there's 1 state, and that's also fine. But the one thing you cannot do is say, we demand a situation in which Jews maintain superior power because we feel Jews need it. We don't have to ever have a conversation trying to explain that Palestinians have the same rights as Jews and Jews have the same rights as Palestinians. No solution is okay that expects one to give up their rights for the security of the other. Because we all know that on social media, so often it goes back to 1 + 1 is 2 and goes back to the same basic conversations. And that is exhausting. And it's nice not to have to go back to that in this space, I would say. And it really does allow for better conversations, even though sometimes people's emotions get heated up. And in that case, one of the moderators steps in and just reminds people, this is not the usual social media space. We're a community. We might even delete a comment every once in a while that gets reported as violating a rule, but it actually doesn't happen too often.
Okay, so some of what you've said is responding to what I was thinking a next question would be, which in a certain way, now granted, I think most people tend to think that their view is actually the view of a silent majority. And I was thinking like, okay, so what's the difference between what your group is and, what I surmise is the silent majority? Some of what you've said has made that distinction, right? I mean, I'm not sure that a lot of the things that you've described in terms of the principles that you have to accept would necessarily be ones that everybody out there who's kind of silent in this conversation would accept, but not necessarily because they disagree with them. It's just that they haven't necessarily thought that deeply or that comprehensively. So, and then I was going to ask you whether you could describe, or is there a distinction between what back in my day we used to call liberal Zionism and what you're describing? And I think you've started to get at some of those ways in which it's a set of distinct ideas. I wanted to ask you, though, okay, so your group the Facebook group and what it may become is itself one kind of contribution. It's saying, okay, let's create a space for a certain set of folks to be able to have thoughtful conversations without worrying about being trolled or snark or all those kinds of things, and let that conversation within these principles really develop. I'm curious if you could maybe from that experience or just more generally talk about how folks, for example, from your group would be able to talk with folks from outside your group and be able to have difficult conversations with folks who may not yet be ready to sign on to all those principles. Like, how could we do better, whether we're talking within a university setting or more broadly, when I think a lot of people just haven't understood the depth of this issue in the nuance that you've just described?
On the idea of silent majority, I don't think we do represent a silent majority. We created the group to bring together what I think is increasingly a narrower and narrower slice of the Jewish community. And I guess I would say, sadly, a slice of the Jewish community that is both committed to Palestine solidarity principles and that feels a connection to Israel. So Josh and I are both Gen Xers. When I think about folks much younger than us, if they are engaged in Palestine solidarity, they tend to not be very interested in Israel anymore. They've grown up with Israel as an occupier, as they see it as a warmonger. They see it as being extremely violent towards Palestinians and denying their rights. Now, I think Josh and I probably have both spent a lot of time thinking about how in many ways this was the case even when we were younger and we just didn't see it yet. But now the younger folks are really seeing it, and they don't have an urge to think of themselves as diaspora Jews vis-a-vis Israel. So they don't think of themselves as the periphery vis-a-vis the core of Israel. And I think Josh and I and those in Drachim, for the most part, feel that attachment as well as Palestine solidarity. Now, there may be cases, and I think we are perhaps even the two of us even noticing this as moderators, that there are some people who perhaps in May 2021 joined both with the aim of engaging in Palestine solidarity and with the affective feeling of closeness to Israel. And as the war, the assault on Gaza has proceeded, I think maybe that affective attachment has lessened a lot, and there's a lot more anger towards Israel than there is in any way affection, and that may very well be the case.
I agree with Mira on the effects of October 7th, right? So immediately after October 7th, our numbers exploded because there were a lot of people who care about Palestinians and care about Jews who felt abandoned by groups on the left that didn't condemn October 7th, which our group very much does. Then as the war dragged on and Israel's behavior became more and more atrocious, the mood of the group grew far more critical of Israel, and the disconnect from Israel grew. That has had the effect in some cases of Israelis in the group, and there are some, and others feeling that there was a little bit too much harshness towards Israel and not enough of the love for Israel. And I don't think the love is not there for the people of Israel, but I think that the sense of just utter despair of the government and its behavior, and also popular sentiment in Israel, the way knowledge of what's happening in Gaza is suppressed and deliberately suppressed, for example. I think that has affected the mood in the group to a certain extent. And particularly, if you remember the famous article of Peter Beinart years ago, that, people are going to leave Israel because they're asked to check their liberalism when they get to Ben Gurion, this gives people a place to stay connected to Israel. I'm glad that people have a way of staying connected instead of just walking away. It models discourse that people can then take outside the group, and also it allows us to educate each other and strengthen each other's knowledge base so that when we leave the group and have other conversations, we're all ambassadors for an ideal of equality and love that I think does have an effect. When you're right, by the way, most people, the so-called silent majority, most people they have busy lives. They're not so committed to Israel-Palestine as the people in this chat are, and the people in Drachim are. Most people are busy with their families and jobs and careers, and they have opinions, but it doesn't mean that they're so knowledgeable, and doesn't mean that they're wrong not to be so knowledgeable. They have busy lives. But to the extent that we can approach them and sort of show them that what they're thinking is problematic, right? So when it comes to liberal Zionism, we definitely have members who consider themselves liberal Zionists. I have to say not very many, because part of the problem of liberal Zionism, that whole term is relatively new. If you do one of those Google searches for the term, you'll find out that it explodes around 20 years ago. And the reason for that is roughly around, I would argue, is that that's roughly around the time that the two-state solution became impossible. It's roughly around the time that the number of Jews in the West Bank started really exploding, forgive bad choice of words, but growing rapidly. And liberal Zionism needs there to be a two-state solution so that Jews can have hegemony. The liberal Zionist idea is that Jews maintain superior power over Palestinians in some form or another, but they think that that can happen and still be democratic and equal. But you can't have hegemony, ethnocracy and be equal. It's one or the other. And so I think that's going to be a problem from a liberal Zionist perspective. And that problem, Shaul Magid has spoken about this quite a lot, is just going to grow every month, every year. But we do have people who consider themselves liberal Zionists, and as long as they subscribe to the 7 principles of the group, then they're welcome to be part of the conversation. But I do think that our conversations in the group can then leave the group and engage with well-intended people who really mean well, but aren't necessarily considering the full extent, the full end game of what liberal Zionism has to mean and what that means in terms of equality. So I hope we have an effect, on broader discourse beyond the 1,100 members that we talk to.
On liberal Zionism, there's a reason why we don't use the word Zionism or anti-Zionism or non-Zionism in any of the principles that prospective members are required to sign on to. And that is because Zionism is understood so very differently across speakers. Another thing I'd like to add about liberal Zionism is that I spent a lot of time in the liberal Zionist blogosphere, blogging, writing columns as a liberal Zionist, arguing both with people to my so-called right and to my so-called left. And there was one argument I constantly had with people to my left, and that was over refugee return. And there came a point where I just said to myself, I can no longer, in good conscience, oppose Palestinian return. And to my mind, that is the biggest difference between liberal Zionists and non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. On how we can better engage with people outside this group. We think of this group as an incubator, as a way of stress testing some of our assumptions, as a way of engaging in informed dialogue among people who, again, are committed to Israel's welfare, are committed to Palestine solidarity. Having those kinds of discussions, which are very well informed, grounded in facts and knowledge and history, can then help us have effective conversations outside the group with people who are curious and want to think about a better way.
So I really want to sit more with, the 2-part goal of your group around having a space for people on some level with a certain set of political principles. I mean, there are those direct principles that they agree to, even if there's differences within those principles of how people apply them, and sort of this cultural piece. And I agree with you, like where the group has traveled, and I'm a member of the group, so I'm partially asking this as somebody who is in it. The ways you talked about what the group is and was, what I would start with, honestly, there's high standards. And it's not only that you don't have trolls, it's like that's part of what I think comes from this. It's that there's like a little bit of, I don't want to call it peer pressure, but there's like, if you say something that demonstrates you aren't particularly deep in some of this stuff, like people will name that. They're not going to be mean about it, but I think it creates a really useful container. And what I'd say, responding a little to Dan's question about how people might apply it externally to other spaces, I, for sure, over the past year, have seen this space as a supportive one for me to try out some kind of framework or argument in the contexts that I might be using them in the future, and see how it lands on people. Notice when folks have pushback, even within my ideological general, like, situating of myself. So, like, I've used it that way a ton. But what I want to sit with is the culture piece. Some folks listening could come away with different notions of what you mean about like an appreciation for Israel's and Palestinian culture. As one example, when I was in college, there was the Israel Committee, whose purpose was to be, quote unquote, Israeli culture. Let's do food events with falafel. Let's do screenings of Israeli-made films that are not about, quote unquote, the conflict. Like that was the Israel Committee. And it was very intentionally scaffolded as separate from the quote unquote Israel advocacy groups. What would actually happen, though, is the events called culture would end up being political. They would end up centering certain narratives of what Israeliness and Israel are, what it should be. But that sort of categorization operates across Jewish life. And so I'm nervous that people would hear this and be like, oh, are they just doing that thing of like, oh, we're going to talk culture, but really we're slipping in all sorts of stuff that like in less blatant, less direct ways is actually cementing Zionist and even hardline Zionist narratives. I'd love to talk more about that because like I'm a person who I think like candidly is being described when you talk about younger folks who don't connect to Israeli culture so much. Granted, I have certain Israeli films that are on my favorite lists all time. Footnote, it's great. It's actually about academics. I'm a weirdo,
It's a great
but
film.
it's an incredible movie. And I also have, Israeli music. I have things I like that are Israeli culture, but like if you were to ask me how I think of myself, what my identities are, like nothing is really a core part of that. Lots of things that are Jewish are part of that, and lots of things that connect to that land are part of that. But I guess I'd love to hear like what's operating with that culture piece, even as I know it hasn't been the centerpiece the past year. Like, what are your aspirations for how we appreciate culture, Israeli and Palestinian? Because it's clear to me that the two of you don't mean what a lot of other Jewish organizations mean, which I would describe as almost like an Israel washing. It's painting the happy, lovely, nice side. Here's food, here's movies, here's whatever. Forget about everything else. It's a distraction. That's not what you're doing. I'd love to hear what it is you are.
I think it's an excellent question. And what I'm hearing is that you're suggesting that many organizations use the term culture to suggest that politics should be bracketed, to suggest that any discussion of power and oppression is not welcome here. We are very much the opposite in Drachim. We are very much committed to ending the denial of Palestinian rights between the river and the sea. When we talk about culture, what we're talking about is signaling a future where both peoples are nurtured individually and collectively. When we talk about culture, what we're doing is we're signaling for those who feel that Esperanto should be the language between the river and the sea. And of course, that's not usually what they're saying. It's really for people who feel there should just be one state between the river and the sea. It should be Arabic speaking and that's it. And Jews can decide to assimilate into an Arabic language polity, or they can leave, they can go back to Europe, all these kinds of hateful things that you hear. We are committed to a non-assimilationist model in both directions. We're committed to nurturing the individual and collective identities of both Palestinians and Israeli Jews. And culture is a shorthand for saying that. Culture is a way of saying we want Israeli, Jewish, Hebrew life to be nurtured, the sense of Israeli Jews as a people, the sense of Jews as a people. And of course, once you go to Israel, you are inculcated in the Israeli version of Jewishness, which is enacted in Hebrew and according to all sorts of other aspects of the Jewish calendar that are specific to Israel, let's just say. So it's really a way of signaling not only individual rights, not only one person, one vote, but really collective rights. So really some sort of and again, we're agnostic about one state, two state, or a confederal approach, but what we're not agnostic about is an assimilationist model that just rolls over anything that erases the collective identities of both peoples.
For what it's worth, I do think that culture is an underrated way to engage politics. Like, I have found that in terms of stuff people read or engage that shifts their world, it's much more likely to be things that we call culture than things that we call scholarship. And I'm saying that to two scholars. It's maybe not like achieving change through film. I actually think happens all the time. We don't always notice it, but I think it's key. So that's one realm of culture. But I guess I wanted to ask a little more about the pieces related to right of return you mentioned, because I do think that, and Dan said this, like it points to the uniqueness of your space. You are right, as far as I know, that there are not other spaces who have as part of their mission an appreciation for Israeli culture, granted, alongside Palestinian culture, broader Jewish culture, but like Israeli culture. I don't know of other spaces where that is an explicit part of the goal and where an explicit principle that you sign on for is, we could talk about it as right of return of Palestinian refugees, or we could talk about it in the way, Joshua, you were, as equality. And so I'd kind of love to ask, like, this starts to veer more towards like a geopolitics question than a how we talk about a question. But like, what does it reflect that you actually can have a group that is invested in the right of Palestinians to return? Which, by the way, it's one of the 3 core bullet points of the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which I don't say to suggest like you are, the two of you are fully on board, all those. I say it because it's true, and yet it's coexisting with a commitment to Israeli culture that at least arguably is opposed to that. I mean, it's opposed to people who support cultural boycotts of Israel, potentially. So I'd love to hear more about that.
It's true that it's one of the 3 pillars of the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, but I would prefer to describe it as one of the many principles of international law. And that's where what we're really talking about is justice. And one way to have justice is, or I would say one way not to have justice, is to have people come back to their homes and kick out the people who are now living there. So we don't advocate for injustice to happen on the heels of justice being achieved. So the question is, how should refugee return be achieved? And we don't go over this in the principles. We don't ask people to sign on to a particular refugee return plan. But for those who are curious, for those who are out there thinking about this today, I would urge you to go to Sucharov, which is the name of an Israeli NGO. It means remember, but it's the sort of the feminized version. It's kind of almost like what we would maybe today say queering of a certain grammar. It has very detailed plans of what refugee return could look like. I would also encourage listeners to think about the vision advanced by a group called A Land for All, which I'm active in. It is a joint Israeli and Palestinian group which talks about refugee return in a very particular way. In their case, they talk about Palestinian refugees returning to what became Israel as residents of the state of Israel, and then they would be citizens of the state of Palestine. So there's ways around this that don't affect the demography in ways that many Jews or Israelis get nervous about. So there's lots of creative solutions and creative methods to enact refugee return. The key point that Josh and I are committed to is justice and equality as expressed by international law.
Like Mira, it was a turning point for me to realize I had to accept the Palestinian right of return, that I was simply not consistent with my own ideology if I didn't. Because why are Jews okay having a Jewish right of return? Because they have an ethnic identity that connects them 2,000 years ago to that land, but people who were literally kicked out of that land, or their parents or grandparents were kicked out, are not allowed to return. Eventually, I just couldn't hold that. I had a cognitive dissonance, and I had to realize it was unacceptable. For me, the turning point was probably when there was a brouhaha over Ben and Jerry's boycotting the West Bank and not boycotting Israel. And people said, that's anti-Semitic. And I couldn't understand why. And I finally realized, because the core of liberal Zionism is that Jews had more rights than Palestinians. And I couldn't accept that. So I switched to an ideology that said Jews have the same rights as Palestinians, and the Palestinians have the same rights as the Jews. And one model I often say that helped me, and maybe will help others, was the following. Now, imagine a situation where, God forbid, Palestinians somehow overthrow Jews in Israel-Palestine. I'm not saying, God forbid, an end to Jewish hegemony, but God forbid, a reversal of that, right? Where millions of Jews are exiled, and of the millions that remain, a quarter are given citizenship in the new state of Palestine, and the rest are left under military occupation.
Which, just to be clear, that's the parallel to what those numbers are parallel to what's happening. The exact reverse
of the current situation. Again, the exact reverse. The whole country's named Palestine. All Palestinians are citizens. Of the millions of Jews are exiled. Of the millions who remain, only a fraction are given citizenship. And Palestine says, we cannot give the rest of Jews citizenship. We cannot give the rest of the Jews the right of return because they would oppress us and act violently towards us. Look what's been happening for decades. We have no choice. And you are a racist if you expect us to do otherwise. The world and the Jews certainly would not accept that. They would say, this is unacceptable. You are being anti-Semitic and discriminatory and violating international law. You must immediately allow all of the Jewish refugees to return. You must immediately give equal citizenship to every Jew in the country. And they would be right to demand that. They would be right to call that a violation of international law. And I think anyone listening has to agree that would be absolutely unacceptable if Palestinians did this, even though they could say, look how Israel's been treating us. We have reason to be afraid. Likewise, now I don't see the difference. I don't see if that would be wrong, if that would be a violation of international law, if that would be anti-Semitic. How is the reverse also not unacceptable, also not a violation of international law, also not racist, right, as a reverse of anti-Semitism? That model, I have no good answer to that except that it's the same. It's the same. And I understand that Jews feel vulnerable for a variety of reasons, but that doesn't allow, no state is allowed to do this because it feels vulnerable. No state is allowed to commit apartheid or ethnic cleansing, even if it feels like it has a reason to do so for its own security. Because the fact is, all forms of collective violence and discrimination have been justified as defensive in human history. I often say it goes back to Exodus chapter 1, verse 10, where Pharaoh says, let's get really smart with these Jews before they can rise up against us. Let's enslave them. And the same is true, even lahavdil. I'm not saying that's happening in Israel-Palestine, but even the Holocaust itself was justified defensively. Certainly apartheid was justified defensively. Slavery in America, Jim Crow, all of these things were justified as necessary defensive actions to protect ourselves against these mobs. I don't think that it can be justified that way. And therefore, I came to the conclusion that I have to have a reorientation that focuses on equality and that rejects calls for violence against Jews or the expulsion of Jews as well. The future of equality has to be equality. There can't be an anti-colonial payback of any kind. That's not how justice works.
So I think this is a good opportunity maybe to start talking about language. My wife had what I think is a great idea about the game Taboo, which is a card game where you're not allowed to say certain words, and then somebody has to guess the word that you're thinking of. And she said we should have like a Jewish community taboo where you're not allowed to say Zionism, anti-Zionism, apartheid, genocide, Nakba, whatever all the words are that people tend to understand differently. That's the point, that because we end up tossing out these words, we are not really able to talk about what we're trying to talk about. And Mira, I know this is something that you've done a lot of thinking about and a lot of research about, so I wanted to start there. But I also am thinking, on the one hand, Josh, when you were talking, I was like, oh, you're modeling right now this ability to say and to make the point kind of simple, like just because you're afraid of something doesn't give you carte blanche to do anything you can possibly think of to defend yourself from the thing you fear. Sort of half of it felt very aligned with this taboo idea. And then the other half, I think you were kind of using language that I know triggers a lot of people out there. Apartheid, ethnic cleansing. People talk a lot about genocide. And obviously, these are words that are powerful, which is at least in part, I think, why they're used. And yet, I'm wondering if even those words we should think about in the same way that, Mira, I know that you're thinking about the word Zionism. Like, are there ways that we could talk about this and have a more rich and a more valuable conversation without having to get into the nuances of what are the dictionary definitions of these words and the fact that most people don't even know what the dictionary definitions are anyway, so they're using them in a casual way and the other person's using it in a different casual way, but they mean very different things and they sort of get in the way of conversation. So I'm curious if we could start a conversation about that topic.
Sure, I'd love to weigh in about Zionism. A couple of years ago, I ran a survey with American Jews. Are you a Zionist? I asked. And 58%, so a solid majority, said they're a Zionist. Then I gave a definition. I said, I'm going to give you a definition of Zionism. Zionism means the belief in a Jewish and democratic state. Are you a Zionist? And the numbers went right up to 72%. said they were a Zionist according to that definition. Then I gave them another definition. I said, I'm going to give you another definition. Zionism means a sense of emotional attachment to Israel. Are you a Zionist? Again, 72% said they were. Then I gave them another definition. I didn't tell them where I'd got this definition, but I knew in my head and in my heart and from talking to many Palestinians that the definition I was about to give them is what Palestinians think of when they hear the term Zionism. It's what Palestinians have experienced at the hands of Zionism. So I said, I'm going to give you another definition. Zionism means the privileging of Jews over non-Jews in Israel. Zionism means the privileging of Jews over non-Jews in Israel. Are you a Zionist? The numbers went down from 72% right down to 10%. According to that definition, only 10% of American Jews were willing to say they were Zionists. This gave me a huge amount of insight into how people are thinking about Zionism in such different ways. People who support Israel in their hearts think about it one way, and Palestinians think about it so very differently.
It's such an important question. I've long felt that what Zionism is and has always been for most Jews is a kind of civil religion, the way nationalisms can be, a kind of identity, a form of Jewishness, a way of being an ethnic Jew without having to be connected to any particular denomination, certainly not Orthodoxy. For most Jews, when they express Zionism, and this is in line with what Mira found in her work, it is some sort of generic connection to Israel, support for Israel's existence, without really knowing what that means. I had a student once, an adult student, an adult learner in one of my adult classes in his 50s or 60s, said to me, I don't understand why Palestinians are so opposed to Zionism. I didn't want him to feel laughed at, but in my head I was laughing, and I said to him, why would they possibly not be opposed to Zionism? I mean, Zionism has meant their displacement. They were the losers of Zionism. Zionism was Jews coming to the land and taking over and and displacing them in many ways. But it later dawned on me, I think for him, Zionism was just Jews feel connected to Israel. There isn't Israel. And so I think what I've learned is a couple things. First of all, and this has been especially important for the last year with the college campus unrest, protests against Israel, to the extent that they are not devolving into anti-Semitism, which I don't think they do nearly as often as they're accused of, they're about a state and a state's actions when they do it correctly. Whereas Jews, for them, Zionism is a form of identity. And when they hear the protest against the state, what they hear is a protest against their identity. And what has to happen is that the two have to realize what they're talking about and be clear. In other words, when somebody is expressing Zionist identity and Zionist pride, those who protest the state have to let that go and not attack it, because it's not about the state, it's about their identity. And when people are protesting the state, and they're doing it appropriately, Zionists have to let that go. They're not protesting your identity, they're protesting a state. And to the extent that both sides in this conflict can see that and do it better, we have a healthier environment. And so when somebody comes to me and says, earnestly and sincerely, I really want to protest Israel, I think what they're doing is horrific, but I don't want to be anti-Semitic. How do I do that better? My number one advice, and it's only the beginning of a conversation, but the first thing I always say is never use the word Zionism or Zionist, because that is a euphemism often for global Jewry, and it is a euphemism for attacking somebody's identity. Talk about Israel. Talk about the state. Don't talk about Zionism. And that is a better foundation for a healthy protest that avoids any kind of anti-Semitism.
So, Josh, let me ask you, though, about other words, because I hear you. And in terms of Zionism, I always think about, I have a friend who's very much considers himself a Zionist and will say, and he's very angry at anti-Zionists, and I say, well, what do you mean by anti-Zionists? He says, anti-Zionists are people that believe that the only people in the entire world that shouldn't have their own state are the Jews. And I was like, yeah, if that's what they believe, then that would be anti-Semitic. But I don't think that that's what they believe. And on the flip side, there was a New York Times Daily podcast that was interviewing one of the Palestinian protesters on the campus and said, what is a Zionist? And he said, a Zionist is somebody who wants all the land for the Jews only. And I was like, well, that's a subset of Zionists for sure, but the vast majority, maybe not. But again, if you thought that that's what a Zionist was, then I can see why you're, exercised about it, but that's not the definition of Zionism that I think most people would generate from a dictionary or from other sources. So that's clear about Zionism, but I want to ask you about other words like apartheid, genocide, ethnic cleansing, because what I've seen in the discourse is that when somebody accuses Israel of apartheid, for example, a supporter of Israel will pull out a dictionary or, some kind of legal book and, find the particular part of the definition of apartheid that doesn't apply. And will say, and therefore it's not apartheid, right? And the point that the person who said it was apartheid is trying to make is actually something very different. It's saying like, this is wrong, this is unequal, this is, right? It's not about whether, in most cases, I think it's not about whether it fits a particular international law definition. And the same with genocide, right? I mean, I think that a lot of the difficulty with talking about what's going on in Gaza as genocide is that most people think of genocide as basically the Holocaust, right? And an idea that you're trying to wipe out an entire people. And the dictionary definition or the international law definition of genocide is different, but it makes it very difficult to have a conversation because somebody thinks that you just accused Israel of being Nazis, right? So I guess I'm wondering whether those are words that you should also sort of emphatically say we shouldn't use, or how do we think about those words in this conversation?
In terms of the first thing, and the problem is, Zionism doesn't mean that. But in terms of Zionism as implemented in Israel, it does mean that, right? I mean, the government of Israel, the elected government of Israel, which is more popular now than it was a year and a half ago. I mean, maybe not Netanyahu per se, but that ideology, right? It's younger and more religious and more children and more popular than ever. Absolutely is about Jewish privilege. There's no question about it. It's in its laws. It's in its basic laws. It's in what the government is saying over and over again from the president, the prime minister, and the ministers on down. So I just, the idea that Zionism doesn't mean what Israel is doing, I think is inherently problematic. A healthier way of saying is, for many people who call themselves Zionists, they're not connected to what Zionism is actually doing. And therefore, using the term Zionism can be complicated and undermine conversation, because I'm talking about a feeling of being proud Jew, and you're talking about what Zionism is doing as it's implemented in Israel right now. And therefore, we should avoid the term potentially to have a better conversation. So that's the first thing. But beyond that, apartheid, genocide, these are terms of international law. We have to be able to debate these terms and apply them to any state, certainly any state that is a signatory to the Geneva Convention, which Israel is. And yes, it does sometimes shut down conversation. People hear the word apartheid and they shut down. And second of all, they usually compare it to Israel, not to the West Bank. And there, I think there actually is a good debate among scholars of international law whether apartheid should be applied to the entirety of Israel, only to the reality in the West Bank. And I've heard good arguments on both sides. But in my experience, they do not whip out international law. They whip out the South African example and they talk about Israel, not the West Bank.
I'm really grateful for this. I mean, I will say the taboo exercise, Dan, that you described, I like it as an exercise that for a temporary activity where you would need to talk about Israel-Palestine and not use those words, I think it would be helpful because people haven't thought about what those terms actually describe. I will say I'm learning more and more about myself. I have like a borderline theological relationship to words. To me, whenever there's a conversation that starts with, we should stop using X word, there's a part of me viscerally that actually reacts. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying, but like, I believe that it's not that every word has a soul. I'm not going to like get that hokey about it. But I do believe that each unique word in the English dictionary and in other dictionaries possesses with it a certain set of characteristics that we can mobilize to achieve certain kinds of communication, and that to cast one aside as not useful is not beneficial. I mean, Mira, I love what you said about how you use the Palestinian definition of how they've experienced Zionism. What we forget is like the definition of Zionism as Jews have more rights than Palestinians. Like that's also many early Zionists' definition of Zionism. Like people directly said that there would be necessary forms of marginalization and inequality for those who were not Jewish. That was actually very clear and continues to be very clear. I guess I keep on coming back to like Zionism and Israel. I think they operate in people's heads as just like posters on a wall in a classroom. And so to oppose them is like saying, I oppose B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, or I oppose nice, lovely Jewish sentiments. But I find that the answer would be to dive more into the terms to show why that isn't the case. So I'm curious, Mira, if your experience with that survey or otherwise has pointed you towards that or alternatives.
When friends of mine recoil hearing that Israel could ever have engaged in ethnic cleansing or is engaging in it now, I like to remind them of what the pre-state Israeli forces did in April 1948. They drove nearly 70,000 Palestinians out of their homes in Jaffa, leaving only about 3,000 Palestinians there. And it was under a military operation, and the operation was called Operation Chametz, as in the leavened products in Passover that we need to clear our house of if we are observant Jews. Operation Chametz. If that's not ethnic cleansing by design and by intention, I just don't know what is. And I'd like to add one more thing about apartheid. Sometimes people are saying maybe in the West Bank there's some problems, but not in Israel proper. And I think what's really important to remember, even though, yes, the situation for Palestinian citizens of Israel is different than the situation for Palestinians under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, nevertheless, there's one government and one government only, the State of Israel. The State of Israel governs between the river and the sea in different ways. They have a siege along with Egypt on Gaza, of course, before the war. Now it's entirely overrun by Israeli bombs and troops, with Egypt controlling the Rafah crossing. And Israel, of course, controls the lives of its Palestinian citizens and its Israeli citizens, and it controls the lives of Palestinians in the West Bank, notwithstanding the fact that the Palestinian Authority has some local control, and notwithstanding the fact that Hamas within Gaza had some local control.
How can we actually engage, again, that silent majority? Because I'm not sure that it really matters to engage the unsilent on the, very much on the other side. But that silent majority that's saying, I really, like you say, I do feel a connection to Israel. I wish Israel well. I feel like it's something that I want to see in the world. And at the same time, I think that there are really bad things going on, but I'm not sure what they are exactly. And I'd like to sort of help find a place that will feel right to me. How do we use language to successfully help them navigate that? And in some ways, that's what I feel the mission of this series is, at least for me, of these episodes.
If that's the question people are asking, then what I tend to do is turn them to the future. The future, not in a predictive sense, because that would be too depressing, but in a prescriptive sense. What should happen? There are roughly 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews between the river and the sea. They're going to either live by the sword and die by the sword, or there can be a different way. And what do we want to see for the people living there? We want equality, we want freedom, we want safety. It's another reason why I tend to use safety rather than security, because security can be triggering for Palestinians. So instead, I really try to harness it at the level of individual and collective welfare. What do we want to see? And I happen to have a group that I believe in that is envisioning a future that will be full of justice and equality and self-determination for both. And that is embodied in a group called A Land for All, which is joint Palestinian and Jewish. But really, I think focusing people on the future and what needs to happen for everybody to flourish is a way of reducing the heat, increasing the light, and it avoids the kind of triggering that you're talking about that leads people to shut their ears.
Thank you both so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close this episode, we want to encourage you, if you haven't listened yet to our first few episodes in this mini-series on Israel-Palestine and American Jewish discourse, they're in your podcast apps. Whichever one you're listening to this one on, you can go back and listen to those, and we hope that you'll continue journeying with us through the rest of this unit in the coming weeks. As we close, we want to encourage you to be in touch with us. We've so appreciated the notes you've sent so far with your follow-up questions from these podcasts, with your comments, with your visions for the future. All of that is super welcome, and you can be in touch in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and any of our others. And of course, you can email us at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. The last request we'd make is that we're deeply appreciative whenever you're able to support our work, either on a monthly recurring financial basis or just via a one-time gift. And you can do either of those at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.